Module 13, Carbon Markets and Article 6. Picture a small province in the north of a country like yours. There's a stretch of degraded forest that, left alone, would slowly be cleared for charcoal and cassava. A project comes in, pays the communities to protect and restore it, and every year that forest holds carbon that would otherwise have gone into the atmosphere. Now imagine a factory in Europe, or an airline, or the government of Switzerland, paying for exactly that protection and counting it against their own climate promises. That transaction, that invisible pipe connecting a European balance sheet to allow Hillside, is a carbon market. And whether it helps your country or quietly robs, it depends on a set of rules most people have never read. By the end of this module, you'll understand the difference between compliance and voluntary carbon markets, what Article 6 of the Paris Agreement actually created, and the one idea that matters most for a host developing country: that selling a carbon credit can cost you a piece of your own climate target if you're not careful. Let's start with the thing being sold. A carbon credit is a certificate that represents 1 ton of carbon dioxide, or its equivalent in other greenhouse gases, that was either kept out of the atmosphere or pulled back out of it. 1 credit, 1 ton, that's the unit. You'll also hear people call these carbon offsets, and for our purposes, the words are close enough to treat the same. The idea is simple and a little strange. If it costs a company in a rich country $100 to cut 1 ton of its own emissions, but only $10 to pay for 1 ton of reduction somewhere else, then, the theory goes, the atmosphere doesn't care where the ton is cut. So let the money flow to wherever cutting is cheapest. That's the entire economic logic of carbon markets in one sentence. The climate is a global problem, so pay for reductions where they're cheapest. Now, that logic has an obvious appeal and a serious danger, and holding both in your head at once is the whole skill here. The appeal is that money flows from where it's abundant to where reductions are cheap, which often means to developing countries. The danger is that a company gets to keep polluting at home and call it net zero because it bought a cheap certificate that may or may not represent a real, lasting, additional ton. Keep both of those in mind. We'll come back to them. There are 2 broad kinds of carbon market, and you need to keep them separate in your mind. The first is the compliance market. A compliance market exists because a law forces it to. A government puts a cap on how much a set of industries is allowed to emit, hands out or auctions a limited number of permits, and says, if you want to emit, you must hold a permit for every ton. The European Union's emissions trading system is the biggest example. Companies that pollute less than their allowance can sell their spare permits to companies that pollute more. Because the total number of permits is capped and shrinks over time, the whole system is squeezed downward year by year. That's why you'll hear it called cap and trade. The key thing about compliance markets is that participation is mandatory and the price is often high because real legal obligations are at stake. The second kind is the voluntary carbon market. Here nobody is forced to do anything. A company decides, for its own reputational or ethical reasons, that it wants to claim it's offsetting its emissions, so it voluntarily buys credits from projects around the world. This is the market of forest protection credits, cookstove projects, methane capture schemes. It's been running for years through private standard setters with names like Verra and Gold Standard, organizations that write the rules a project must follow and certify that a ton is really a ton. The voluntary market is much smaller than the compliance market, and it's had a rough few years. A wave of investigations found that many forest protection credits, in particular, represented far fewer real reductions than claimed. Prices fell, trust fell, and the whole sector has been trying to rebuild its credibility. Hold that thought, because integrity is the theme that runs under everything in this module. If the voluntary market has such a bad reputation, why would my country bother engaging with it at all? Because for many developing countries, it's one of the few ways to attract private money into forests, soils, and rural livelihoods that no bank would otherwise finance. A well-run project can bring real revenue to communities that protect ecosystems. The problem was never the idea. It was weak rules and weak verification. So the game for a country like yours isn't to avoid these markets. It's to engage on strong terms, with good national oversight, so the credits you host are the credible ones people actually want to buy. Being the trusted supplier in a market full of junk is a genuine advantage. Now we come to the part that changed the rules for governments. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Everything so far, compliance systems, voluntary standards, mostly involved companies. Article 6 is about countries trading with each other and about a new United Nations mechanism sitting over the top. It took years to negotiate, because the details are where all the danger lives, and the core rulebook was finally settled at the COP29 climate conference in Baku in late 2024. Article 6 has two parts you need to know. The first is Article 6.2. This lets two countries strike a deal directly, government, to trade emission reductions. The jargon term for what gets traded is an internationally transferred mitigation outcome, which everyone shortens to the initials ITMO, pronounced ITMO. An ITMO is just a nationally authorized carbon reduction that one country sells to another to count toward that buyer's national climate pledge. Switzerland moved first here, signing bilateral deals with countries and authorizing the first such transfers from 2024. For example, paying for cleaner cookstoves and cleaner transport in partner countries and counting those reductions toward Switzerland's own target. So Article 6.2 is the country-to-country channel, run through bilateral agreements, with each deal negotiated on its own terms. The second part is Article 6.4. This is a centralized mechanism run under the United Nations itself, now given a proper name, the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, or PACM. Think of it as the UN's own quality-controlled carbon market, the successor to the old Clean Development Mechanism that some of you will remember from the Kyoto era. A project registers with the mechanism, follows UN-approved methods, gets its reductions verified, and receives credits that carry a UN stamp. The core standards for how PACM works were adopted at that same Baku conference in 2024, and the first credits are expected to be issued around 2026. So as you're listening to this, PACM is moving from paper into practice. The promise of the centralized mechanism is higher, more consistent quality than the patchy voluntary market, because everyone plays by one UN rulebook. Now here is the single most important concept in this entire module, and I want you to slow down with me for it. It's called the corresponding adjustment. This is the accounting rule that stops 1 ton of reduction from being counted twice. Let me build it up carefully, because this is where a practitioner earns their keep. Every country under the Paris Agreement has a national climate pledge, its nationally determined contribution, its NDC, the target it promised the world. That target is measured against the country's total emissions. Now suppose a project in your country reduces emissions by 100,000 tons, and those reductions are sold as ITMOs to Switzerland. Switzerland wants to count those 100,000 tons toward its target. Fair enough, it paid for them. But here's the trap. Those reductions physically happened inside your borders. When your country adds up its own emissions to see how it's doing against its own target, that same 100,000 tons would naturally show up as a reduction on your books too. If both countries count it, the world has been told about 200,000 tons of climate benefit when only 100,000 actually happened. That's double counting, and it's poison for the integrity of the whole system. The corresponding adjustment is the fix. It says, when you sell a reduction abroad, you must add that tonnage back onto your own national emissions total. You make a corresponding adjustment upward so that you can no longer count it toward your own NDC. The buyer counts it, you don't. The ton is only claimed once. Say it back to yourself. If you sell it, you subtract it from your own tally so it isn't counted twice. Wait, so if my country sells its cheap, easy reductions to a rich country, we've made some money, but now we still have to hit our own national target using only the harder, more expensive reductions that are left. Doesn't that make our own job worse? Yes, and that is exactly the strategic tension every host country has to manage. When you sell a reduction with a corresponding adjustment, you are literally selling a piece of your own climate progress. The buyer's target gets easier, yours gets harder, because you've handed away the low-hanging fruit and still have to meet your promise with what remains. This is why serious governments think hard about which reductions to sell and which to keep. A common approach is to sell only reductions that are additional to your own NDC, the extra effort you wouldn't have done anyway, and to price them high enough that the revenue genuinely funds your remaining transition. Selling cheap and selling everything is how a country ends up with some cash today and a broken target tomorrow. The money is real, but so is the cost, and the cost is denominated in your own future ambition. That tension is why you'll hear ministries talk about protecting their NDC. Some countries have started restricting or taxing carbon exports, or reserving certain sectors, precisely so they don't hollow out their own targets. As a climate practitioner, one of the most valuable things you can do is help your government see a carbon deal not as free money, but as a trade. Revenue now in exchange for a harder path later, and make sure the price reflects that. Let's talk about integrity more directly, because it's the word that will make or break these markets in the years you'll be working in them. For a carbon credit to be honest, it has to clear several bars. The first is additionality. The reduction must be extra, something that would not have happened without the carbon finance. If a hydro dam was going to be built anyway for other reasons, selling its avoided emissions as credits is selling something the atmosphere was getting for free. The second is that the reduction must be real and measurable, not a hopeful estimate. The third is permanence. A ton stored in a forest that burns down 5 years later was never really stored. The fourth is avoiding leakage, which is when you protect one forest and the loggers simply move next door, so no net carbon is saved. And the fifth, the one Article 6 adds on top, is no double counting, which is what the corresponding adjustment protects. Additional, real, permanent, no leakage, counted once. Those 5 are your integrity checklist, and most of the scandals you've read about were failures of one or more of them. It's worth pausing on where the centralized UN mechanism comes from, because the history explains today's caution. Some of you will remember the clean development mechanism from the Kyoto Protocol era, back in the 2000s. It was the first big attempt at exactly this, letting rich countries fund emission reduction projects in developing countries and count the credits. It moved real money and built real projects. But it was also criticized for issuing credits that weren't truly additional, for concentrating in a few large countries like China and India rather than reaching the poorest, and for weak oversight. The Paris Agreement crediting mechanism is deliberately designed to learn from those failures, tougher additionality rules, a stronger focus on environmental integrity, and provisions to steer benefits toward the least developed and most vulnerable countries. When you evaluate a PACM opportunity, you're looking at a system that carries the scar tissue of its predecessor, which is mostly a good thing. One practical mechanism you'll bump into is the registry. A registry is simply an official electronic ledger that records every credit, who created it, who owns it, and crucially, when it's been retired, meaning used up to offset 1 ton and then permanently canceled so it can never be sold again. This sounds like plumbing, and it is, but it's the plumbing that makes double counting physically impossible if it's done right. A credit that isn't tracked in a proper registry, with a clear record of retirement and of any corresponding adjustment, is a credit you should not trust. For a host country, having your own national registry, or secure access to a credible one, is part of the basic infrastructure of engaging in these markets on strong terms. There's one more integrity dimension that matters especially for your world, the developing country world, and that's the rights of the people on the land. A forest carbon project that generates beautiful credits but ignores the communities living in and around that forest, that fences them out, or signs away their land, rights in a contract they didn't understand, is not a good project, no matter what the carbon accounting says. The best modern frameworks insist on the free, prior, and informed consent of local and indigenous communities, and on a fair share of the revenue actually reaching them. This is where your climate and social expertise is worth as much as any carbon accountant's. A deal that's technically sound but socially extractive will eventually collapse, in the courts or in the field. Let me pull the threads together before we recap, because it's easy to get lost in the acronyms. Carbon markets pay for emission reductions where they're cheapest, which often means in countries like yours. Compliance markets are legally mandatory and mostly involve companies under a national cap. Voluntary markets are optional, company-driven, and have been fighting to rebuild their credibility after real integrity failures. Article 6 is the country-level layer. Article 6.2 for direct, bilateral government-to-government trades using those ITMOs, with Switzerland going first. And Article 6.4, the centralized UN mechanism now called PACM, with its rulebook set at Baku and first credits expected around 2026. And running underneath everything is the corresponding adjustment, the rule that when you sell a reduction abroad you must give up counting it toward your own target, so the world never counts the same ton twice. So to bring it together, carbon markets are a genuine channel for climate finance into developing countries, but they are the channel where you most need your wits about you. The money is real, and so is the risk of selling your own future ambition too cheaply. Remember the 5-part integrity test: additional, real, permanent, no leakage, counted once, and add to it the social test of community rights and fair benefit sharing. Remember that Article 6.2 is bilateral and Article 6.4 is the centralized UN mechanism. And remember, above all, that a corresponding adjustment means every credit you export is a piece of your own climate target that you've chosen to hand away. Whether that's a smart trade depends entirely on the price and the terms, and that judgment is exactly where a practitioner like you adds value. Now, carbon markets move money by selling something a project produces. In the next module, we turn to a completely different way of moving large sums into climate projects, not by selling reductions, but by borrowing from the world's biggest pools of savings through the bond market. Let's talk about green bonds.